It was the cold embrace of January, the heart of winter, when our story begins. The world outside was shrouded in a thick, snowy stillness, but inside my thoughts were far from frozen. My son Mark had just turned 19. He was a talented artist, his world filled with sketches and paintings of human figures and forms, each capturing emotion and movement with a breathtaking intensity. His studio, a room in our house he had claimed as his own, was his sanctuary. It was cluttered with canvases, jars of brushes, and streaks of paint that hinted at his passion and dedication. Mark had a maturity about him that often startled me. He was far more grounded than his father, who seemed eternally distracted by work or hobbies that took him away from us. That morning, I was sipping on a steaming mug of coffee, wrapped in a thick robe against the draft that always crept into our kitchen during the colder months. Mark had been working late the night before, and I hadn't had the heart to disturb him. As I stared at the frosted window, lost in thought, I heard the familiar creak of the stairs. "Morning, Mom," Mark greeted, his deep voice warm and steady. He was carrying a canvas under one arm and a cup of tea in the other. His hair was tousled, his face still holding the remnants of sleep, but his eyes were alive with inspiration. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, watching as he placed the canvas carefully against the counter. I couldn't help but smile at his energy, so full of life even in the depths of winter. "Did you sleep at all last night?" He shrugged, a sheepish grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not really. I was working on something. Want to see?" Curiosity sparked, I nodded. He turned the canvas toward me, revealing a painting so vivid and raw that it took my breath away. It was a figure study, the subject's form bathed in soft light, their posture both vulnerable and powerful. There was an intimacy to the piece, a depth of understanding that belied his young age. "It's incredible, Mark," I said softly, meaning every word. "You have a gift." His cheeks flushed, and he looked away, embarrassed by my praise. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without your support." We shared a moment of quiet understanding, the kind that often passed between us in the absence of his father. My husband was a good man, but he was rarely present in the way Mark was. It was something I had grown used to over the years, though it had left a quiet void in my life that I seldom acknowledged. Later that day, as I passed his studio, I couldn't resist peeking inside. Mark was standing in front of another canvas, his brush moving in fluid, confident strokes. His concentration was palpable, his movements precise yet relaxed. He paused when he noticed me, a small smile playing on his lips. "Caught me," he said, his tone light but affectionate. "Want to see what I'm working on now?" I stepped inside, drawn by his invitation. The room smelled of paint and turpentine, and the winter sunlight streaming through the window cast a golden glow over his workspace. He stepped aside, revealing another piece, a study of hands, their positions intricate and expressive. "They're beautiful," I murmured, marveling at his attention to detail. He turned to me then, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking of doing a series," he said, "exploring different emotions through the human form." "That sounds incredible," I replied, genuinely impressed by his ambition. "You've always had a way of seeing things that others miss." Mark's expression softened, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of something unspoken pass between us. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it, a quiet connection that went beyond the usual bond of parent and child. It was a reminder of how much we relied on each other, especially in the absence of his father's presence. The winter days continued, marked by Mark's growing portfolio and our shared moments of warmth amidst the cold. Yet, as we grew closer, I found myself questioning the lines we drew in our relationships and the quiet spaces where love and admiration intertwine. There was no denying it. Mark wasn't just my son. He was also a remarkable young man, one whose presence filled the empty corners of my world. The evening was still and quiet, the sort of January night when the world feels muffled by snow and darkness. My husband, as he often did, had gone out bowling with his friends. It was his way of unwinding, though it always seemed to leave Mark and me alone in a house that suddenly felt warmer without his presence. Mark had been unusually attentive that day, throwing little compliments my way as we worked through our routines. "Mom, you know you've got this way about you," he said earlier as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. I turned to him with a curious smile. "What way?" He leaned casually against the doorway, his lips curved in that easy grin of his. "The way you always manage to make a place feel like home. It's rare, you know." I laughed softly, brushing off his words as the idle flattery of a son, but inside they warmed me. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, with a quiet sincerity that made me feel truly seen. Later that evening, as I sat by the fire flipping through a magazine, Mark appeared from his studio with a box in his hands. His dark eyes held an excited glint, and his smile was almost boyish. "Mom, I have an idea," he said, setting the box on the coffee table in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, intrigued. "Open it," he urged, taking a step back with his hands tucked into his pockets. I lifted the lid to reveal a stunning red satin robe, the fabric shimmering like liquid fire in the soft light. My breath caught. "Mark, what is this for?" He shrugged, though his expression was serious. "I've been thinking about doing a new portrait series. Something intimate, but not in a way that feels distant or cold. I want to capture warmth, elegance, and... Well, would you let me paint you?" I stared at the robe, my heart thudding in my chest. The idea of being his subject both thrilled and unsettled me. "You want me to wear this?" He nodded. "I think it would look amazing on you. It's just for the portrait, of course." After a moment's hesitation, I agreed. There was something irresistible about the way he asked, the way his artistic passion lit up his entire face. "All right," I said softly. "Let's do it." He beamed, his joy contagious. "Great. Go put it on and I'll set up." I took the box upstairs, my hands trembling slightly as I slipped into the robe. The satin felt cool against my skin, the fabric clinging softly to my frame. It was undeniably beautiful, and as I glanced at myself in the mirror, I felt an unfamiliar confidence stirring within me. When I came back down, Mark had transformed the living room. He'd pulled a chair draped with a soft wool blanket into the center of the space, and the fire cast a warm, flickering light over everything. His easel stood nearby, a blank canvas ready to capture whatever vision he had in mind. "You look stunning," he said, his voice low with admiration. His gaze lingered for a moment, but he quickly shook himself, gesturing toward the chair. "Sit here and just relax." I did as he asked, settling into the chair and letting the blanket's texture soothe my nerves. Mark began to work, his brush moving with confident strokes as he glanced between me and the canvas. "Hold still," he said at one point, his tone teasing. "Not that it's hard for you. You've got this natural grace about you." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're too much, Mark." "No, really," he insisted, his gaze meeting mine. "You're beautiful, Mom. I hope this painting does you justice." His words stirred something in me, a blend of pride and vulnerability that I wasn't quite ready to unpack. I stayed silent, letting the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic sound of his brush fill the space between us. As the evening stretched on, the atmosphere shifted. There was a closeness that hadn't been there before, an unspoken connection that went beyond words. Mark's compliments became more personal, his teasing a little softer, and I found myself leaning into the warmth he radiated. "Do you remember," he said suddenly, his brush pausing mid-stroke, "when I was little and I used to draw you with crayons? You'd always keep them, no matter how terrible they were." I smiled at the memory. "They weren't terrible. They were from you. That made them priceless." He chuckled, his gaze softening. "You've always been my favorite subject, you know. Not just for art. For everything." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I felt my cheeks flush. There was something about the way he said it, the depth in his voice, that made me feel more seen and valued than I had in years. When he finally finished, he stepped back and studied the canvas with a critical eye. "Done," he announced, a note of pride in his tone. I stood and crossed the room to see the painting. It was stunning. A portrait of me bathed in the warm glow of the firelight, the satin robe draped elegantly over my shoulders. But it wasn't just the technical skill that struck me. It was the way he had captured something deeper, something I hadn't realized I carried. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Mark turned to me, his expression serious. Thank you for everything." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the painting or the way Mark had looked at me. Our relationship had always been close, but now it felt like something was shifting, becoming richer, more layered. And as unsettling as that thought was, it was also undeniably comforting. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room as I stirred awake. Before I could fully gather my thoughts, the scent of fresh coffee wafted toward me, and I opened my eyes to see Mark standing by my bedside, a playful grin on his face. In one hand he held a steaming mug, and in the other a single flower, a daisy, simple yet sweet. "Morning, Muse," he teased, his voice warm and affectionate. "I thought you deserved a little extra pampering today." I couldn't help but smile, still half asleep but utterly charmed by his thoughtfulness. "You're spoiling me," I murmured, sitting up as he placed the coffee on the nightstand. "That's the idea," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and offering me the flower. His expression softened as he studied me, his gaze lingering in a way that made my heart flutter. "You've been my inspiration, Mom. I don't think I've ever felt this connected to my work, or to someone." His words left me breathless, the honesty in his voice piercing through my usual composure. Before I could respond, he lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "There's more to come," he said, his tone playful now. "Tonight I have a surprise for you, but you'll have to keep the studio door shut. If Dad sees, well, let's just say he wouldn't understand." My pulse quickened at his words, a mix of anticipation and nervousness swirling in my chest. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Mark chuckled, standing up. "You'll see. I need to grab a few things first. But trust me, you'll love it." With that, he left the room, and I was left with the coffee, the flower, and a storm of emotions I wasn't entirely ready to face. Throughout the day, I found myself replaying his words, his gestures, the way he had looked at me. I felt giddy, as though I were a teenager with a crush, but also conflicted. Mark wasn't just anyone, he was my son. And yet, the way he treated me, the way he saw me, made me feel like a woman again, not just a mother or a wife. As the hours passed, my anticipation grew. I busied myself preparing dinner, pouring 2 glasses of wine, and trying not to overthink what the evening might bring. By the time I finally made my way to Mark's studio, my heart was racing. The door creaked open, and there he was, standing amidst the familiar clutter of canvases and paint. He looked different somehow, more confident, more sure of himself. In his hands was a small red box, its bold color catching the light. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and inviting. "Come in." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me as he gestured for me to sit on the chair he had positioned in the center of the room. The atmosphere was intimate, the air filled with the faint scent of paint and the soft hum of music playing in the background. My curiosity piqued as he handed me the box. "Go on," he urged, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. With trembling fingers, I opened it to reveal a sleek leather outfit, a pair of cat ears, black lingerie, and even a small tail. My cheeks flushed as I looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. "You're my muse," he said simply, his tone sincere. "I want to capture you in a way that's bold, fearless, and unapologetically you." I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But the way he looked at me, with such unwavering confidence and admiration, made it impossible to say no. Nodding slowly, I stood and took the box, retreating behind a screen he had set up in the corner. As I changed, the leather hugged my skin in a way that felt both empowering and vulnerable. When I finally stepped out, Mark's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened slightly, and a slow smile spread across his face. "You're perfect," he said softly, gesturing for me to sit again. "Absolutely perfect." He adjusted the lighting, the music, and his easel with practiced ease, then began to sketch, his movements quick and deliberate. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of charcoal on paper and the occasional murmur of approval from Mark. I watched him work, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands steady and sure. There was something intimate about the way he looked at me, studying every curve, every shadow, as though I were the most fascinating subject he had ever encountered. As the evening wore on, the boundaries between us seemed to blur further. Mark's compliments grew bolder, his teasing more affectionate. And though I knew we were treading on delicate ground, I couldn't bring myself to stop him, or to stop the feelings that were blossoming within me. By the time he finished, the connection between us felt undeniable. He set down his tools and stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for trusting me, for letting me see you." Emotion welled up in my chest, but I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I reached out, taking his hand in mine and holding it tightly. The moment felt fragile, yet powerful, like something neither of us fully understood but couldn't deny. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I replayed every detail, every word, every look. I knew our relationship had shifted, deepened in ways that defied explanation. And though I didn't know where it would lead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something extraordinary, and entirely uncharted. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of my phone on the nightstand. Reaching for it, I saw a message from him. "Come to me. I can't sleep." My breath hitched as I read the words, their simplicity loaded with meaning. My heart raced as I debated what to do. But before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself slipping out of bed and padding softly down the hallway toward his studio. The house was silent except for the faint creaks of the wooden floor beneath my feet. When I opened the door, Mark was sitting on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. He looked up as I entered, his eyes searching mine with a mix of hope and vulnerability. "Mom," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to know. Do you feel it too? The way I do." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I knew what he was asking, and though I tried to deny it to myself, I couldn't lie to him. Not when his gaze held mine with such raw honesty. "Yes," I admitted softly, my voice trembling. "I do." A wave of relief washed over his face, and he stood up, closing the distance between us with quick steps. "You were always more than just my mom," he murmured into my skin, his voice thick with emotion. "You were everything to me." I closed my eyes, stunned by the intensity of the moment. His arms pulled me into a hug that felt like the world had melted away, leaving just the two of us. After a moment, he pulled back slightly, his hands still on my shoulders. "I have an idea," he said, his tone changing to something lighter, more playful. "While Dad's asleep, let's do something else. Something just for us." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Paint therapy," he said, his eyes twinkling mischievously. "It's a way of expressing emotion, through touch, through color. I've wanted to try this for a long time, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather share it with than you." The offer caught me off guard, but there was a seriousness in his voice that made it impossible to say no. "Okay," I agreed, a nervous smile playing on my lips. "Show me." Mark's face lit up, and he quickly began gathering his supplies. Bottles of brightly colored paint, a large roll of canvas, and towels to spread out on the floor. As he worked, he explained the process, his excitement infectious. "You just let go," he said, placing the canvas in the center of the room. "No rules, no hesitation. Just emotion." He poured the paint directly onto the canvas, the red, blue, and gold stripes blending together in magical patterns. Then he turned to me, holding out his hand. "Shall we?" I hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. He led me to the canvas, and together we dipped our fingers into the paint, smearing it across the surface. At first it was just playful, stripes of color and laughter as we painted each other's hands and arms. But as night fell, it became something more. Mark's hands moved gently, his touch deliberately drawing intricate patterns on my skin. "You're beautiful," he said softly, looking into my eyes. "Every bit of you." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, but instead of pulling away, I leaned into his touch, letting the moment envelop us. I reached out, tracing a golden line around his collarbone, watching the paint glisten on his skin. The room was filled with the soft hum of music, the flicker of candles, and the warmth of our shared connection. The boundaries between us blurred with every touch of his hand, every look we shared. As the session drew to a close, we lay side by side on the canvas, our bodies covered in swirls of color. Mark turned to me with a gentle expression on his face. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me, for being here." I smiled, my heart full. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. That night, as I returned to my room and lay in bed, I couldn't help but relive every detail. Mark was not just my son. He was a man, strong, passionate, and full of life. And though the path we had taken was unconventional, I couldn't deny the depth of what we shared.